In the dust-swept territories of 1880s Colorado, wealthy families had their own ways of dealing with rebellious daughters. When 18-year-old Catherine Morrison defied one too many social conventions, her father shipped her west to work as hired help on the remote Blackwood Ranch. The work was backbreaking, the conditions harsh, and the ranch owner, Samuel Blackwood, was known for his iron discipline and mysterious past. Catherine expected months of grueling labor under the watchful eye of a stern taskmaster. She expected to learn hard lessons about obedience and proper behavior. What she didn't expect was the quiet 10-year-old boy who worked alongside the ranch hands, helping with chores and keeping to himself, and she certainly didn't expect the moment when that same boy would look up at her with familiar green eyes and whisper words that would shatter everything she thought she knew about her own life. But how could this child possibly know a secret that Catherine herself had buried 5 years ago? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The train's whistle pierced the morning air as Catherine Morrison pressed her face against the soot-stained window, watching the familiar spires of Denver disappear behind rolling hills. In her gloved hands, she clutched a letter bearing her father's official seal, a document that had transformed her from cherished daughter to indentured servant in the span of a single conversation. Harrison Morrison's words still echoed in her mind. "You will learn the value of obedience, Catherine, and the consequences of defying your family's wishes." The letter outlined her employment arrangement at the Blackwood Ranch, a remote cattle operation 3 days' journey into Colorado's untamed territory. She was to work as household help for 1 full year, earning her keep through honest labor until she came to her senses about her obligations to family and society. The scandal that had precipitated her exile seemed almost laughable now, viewed from the uncomfortable bench of a westbound train. She had simply refused to marry Reginald Ashworth, a man twice her age, whose primary qualifications were his substantial bank account and his willingness to overlook her spirited nature in exchange for her father's political connections. When faced with the choice between a loveless marriage and banishment, Catherine had chosen freedom, however uncertain its form. The journey grew increasingly uncomfortable as civilization fell away. The elegant passenger car gave way to a rougher frontier conveyance, then finally to a bone-jarring stagecoach that seemed determined to separate her from every comfort she had ever known. Her fellow passengers, a grizzled prospector, a stern-faced woman in widow's weeds, and a young man with calloused hands and sun-weathered skin, regarded her traveling dress and refined speech with barely concealed amusement. On the final day of travel, the stagecoach crested a ridge and revealed the Blackwood Ranch, spread across a valley like a collection of wooden toys. The main house, a sturdy 2-story structure, sat surrounded by barns, corrals, and outbuildings that spoke of serious agricultural enterprise. Cattle dotted the surrounding pastures, and the sound of hammering suggested ongoing construction or repair. Samuel Blackwood waited beside the ranch house as the stagecoach pulled to a stop. Catherine's first impression was of a man carved from the same rough timber as his buildings, tall, broad-shouldered, with hair the color of weathered leather, and eyes that seemed to catalogue every detail of her appearance in a single glance. His work-worn hands helped her down from the coach with surprising gentleness, though his expression remained as welcoming as granite. "Miss Morrison," he said, his voice carrying the authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed, "I trust your journey was comfortable." "As comfortable as could be expected," Catherine replied, brushing dust from her traveling skirt and trying to project more confidence than she felt. "Maria will show you to your quarters and explain your duties. Work begins at sunrise." Without further ceremony, he turned toward a cluster of ranch hands who had gathered to witness her arrival. Among them stood a boy of perhaps 10 years, small for his age but carrying himself with the quiet dignity of someone older. His dark hair fell across his forehead, partially concealing eyes that seemed to hold secrets too heavy for such young shoulders. While the other hands dispersed to their various tasks, the boy remained, studying Catherine with an intensity that made her unexpectedly uncomfortable. Maria Gonzalez emerged from the house, a woman of middle years whose warm smile provided welcome contrast to Samuel's stern reception. Her calloused hands and flour-dusted apron marked her as the ranch's cook and housekeeper, but her bearing suggested she commanded considerable respect among the workers. "Come, señorita," Maria said, gesturing toward the house. "I show you where you sleep, where you work. Is much to learn, but you will manage, I think." Catherine's assigned quarters occupied a small room off the kitchen, furnished with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a wooden chest for her belongings. Through the single window she could see the boy still standing in the yard, now helping an older ranch hand with a piece of harness that needed mending. As she unpacked her few possessions, Catherine discovered a pressed wildflower tucked between the pages of a Bible left on the washstand. The delicate petals suggested someone else had occupied this room before her, someone who had found beauty worth preserving even in this harsh landscape. The discovery left her with questions she couldn't yet voice, and a strange sense of connection to a woman she would never meet. That first evening, as she sat at the long kitchen table with the other workers, Catherine felt the weight of many eyes upon her. Some showed curiosity, others skepticism about her ability to adapt to ranch life. But it was the boy's gaze that troubled her most, direct, searching, as if he were trying to solve a puzzle whose pieces only he could see. Dawn came too early and too bright, accompanied by the insistent clanging of a bell that seemed designed to wake the dead. Catherine stumbled from her narrow bed, her body protesting the unfamiliar hardness of the straw mattress and the mountain chill that had seeped through the thin walls during the night. Maria appeared in the doorway carrying a steaming cup of coffee and a look of motherly concern. "First day is always hardest, señorita, but you are strong. I can see this." The kitchen buzzed with activity as ranch hands filed through for breakfast. Catherine's job, Maria explained, was to help serve the meal, clean the dishes, and prepare for the day's cooking. Simple enough in theory, but the reality proved far more challenging than anything her privileged upbringing had prepared her for. Her first attempt at flipping flapjacks resulted in a smoking disaster that sent the men into fits of barely suppressed laughter. Her second try at carrying multiple plates ended with scrambled eggs decorating the floor, and her apron. Through it all, Maria remained patient, guiding her hands and offering gentle corrections in a mixture of English and Spanish. Samuel Blackwood entered the kitchen as Catherine was scrubbing the last of the breakfast plates. He moved with the quiet efficiency of a man who wasted neither time nor motion, pouring himself coffee and studying a piece of paper that appeared to contain the day's work assignments. "Miss Morrison," he said without looking up, "when you finish there you'll help Maria with the laundry. After that the chicken coop needs cleaning, and the vegetable garden requires weeding." Catherine nodded, though the prospect of such physical labor made her soft hands ache in anticipation. As Samuel turned to leave, the quiet boy appeared in the doorway, carrying a small wooden horse carved with obvious skill and care. The toy bore the marks of constant handling, its surface worn smooth by small fingers. "Thomas," Samuel said, his voice softening noticeably, "what do you need?" "Jake says the fence in the south pasture has a broken post," the boy replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "He wants to know if we should fix it today or wait for the lumber order. Tell him to make do with what we have. We can't afford to wait." Samuel's tone carried worry that hadn't been present when speaking to Catherine. Thomas nodded and started to leave, but his eyes lingered on Catherine with that same searching intensity she had noticed the evening before. For a moment their gazes met, and she felt an odd flutter of recognition, as if she were looking into a mirror that reflected not her appearance, but something deeper. The morning's work proved as demanding as Samuel had promised. The laundry involved hauling buckets of water from the well, heating it over the kitchen fire, and scrubbing clothes on a washboard that left her knuckles raw. Maria worked beside her, maintaining a steady stream of conversation about ranch life, the surrounding territory, and the characters who populated this remote corner of the world. "The boy, Thomas," Catherine ventured during a break in their labor. "He seems very quiet." Maria's expression grew thoughtful. "See, very quiet. He comes to us 3 years ago from the city. Senor Samuel, he gives him a home when nobody else wants him." "Nobody else wanted him. Is complicated, senorita. The boy, he has troubles before, bad dreams, strange fears, but here, he is better. Senor Samuel, he is good with children who need patience." Catherine found herself wondering about Thomas's history as she moved on to cleaning the chicken coop. The work was unpleasant and foreign, but she discovered an unexpected satisfaction in completing tasks that had clear beginnings and endings. Her father's business dealings had always seemed shrouded in complexity and compromise, but here, a clean coop was simply a clean coop. The vegetable garden provided welcome relief from the morning's heavier chores. As she knelt among the rows of beans and squash, pulling weeds with her increasingly dirty hands, Catherine felt something she hadn't experienced in months. Peace. The sun warmed her shoulders, and the earth smelled rich and full of promise. Thomas appeared among the garden rows carrying a small pail of water. Without speaking, he began helping her with the weeding, his small hands moving with practiced efficiency. They worked in comfortable silence until he suddenly spoke. "You're different from the others who came before," he said, not looking up from his work. "Others? The women Senor Samuel hired to help Maria. They didn't stay long. Said the work was too hard, the place too lonely." Catherine considered this. "And what do you think of me so far?" Thomas finally looked at her directly, those green eyes studying her face with uncomfortable intensity. "I think you're not really here to learn about work," he said. "I think you're here because you're looking for something." The observation struck her as remarkably perceptive for a child, and unsettling in its accuracy. Before she could respond, he had gathered his water pail and disappeared between the rows of corn, leaving her alone with questions she couldn't yet answer. The days blended into a rhythm of dawn bells and evening exhaustion, each one teaching Catherine new lessons about the weight of honest labor and the satisfaction of earned rest. Her soft hands developed calluses, her pale skin acquired a healthy flush from mountain sun, and her body adapted to the demands of physical work with surprising resilience. Samuel Blackwood proved to be a fair but demanding employer. He expected excellence in all tasks, whether feeding chickens or serving meals, and his piercing gaze seemed to catalogue every mistake and improvement with equal attention. Yet Catherine began to notice moments when his stern facade cracked slightly, when he thought no one was watching, when Thomas was nearby, when Maria hummed old Mexican songs while cooking. The discovery came at the end of her first week, as Catherine cleaned her small quarters before retiring. While moving the washstand to mop beneath it, she noticed a loose floorboard that shifted under her weight. Curiosity overcoming caution, she pried it up to reveal a small cavity containing items left by a previous occupant. There was a hairbrush with silver backing, its handle engraved with the initials EM. A small leather journal contained pressed flowers and brief notations about weather and seasonal changes. Most intriguingly, there was a letter, never sent, addressed to "my dearest sister," and dated 3 years earlier. The letter spoke of loneliness and hope, of finding unexpected kindness in a harsh place, and of a dear boy who reminds me so much of little James. It mentioned Samuel's wounded past and suggested that the ranch served as refuge for more than just its current inhabitants. The final entry was unfinished, ending mid-sentence as if the writer had been interrupted and never returned. Catherine replaced the items carefully, but the discovery left her with new questions about the ranch's history and the people who had found shelter within its boundaries. She began to observe her surroundings with fresh eyes, noting details that spoke of other stories, other struggles. Maria proved to be a font of information when approached correctly. Over shared morning coffee, Catherine learned about harsh winters that tested everyone's endurance, cattle drives that required every hand regardless of size or age, and the delicate balance between survival and prosperity that governed ranch life. The land, She is beautiful, but not forgiving, Maria explained, gesturing toward the mountains that ringed their valley. Senor Samuel, he understands this, is why he helps people who need second chances. Second chances. Jake, he comes here after troubles with drinking. Miguel, he runs from men who want to hurt his family in Mexico. Even I need place to start new after my husband dies. Catherine pondered this revelation as she went about her daily tasks. The ranch began to seem less like a place of punishment and more like a sanctuary for the displaced and dispossessed. Samuel's stern demeanor took on new meaning, not cruelty, but the necessary discipline required to hold such a community together. Thomas remained an enigma, appearing and disappearing throughout her days like a small ghost, with important business elsewhere. He helped with various chores despite his size, showing skill with animals and tools that suggest extensive training. More puzzling were the moments when Catherine caught him watching her, with that same intense expression, as if trying to solve a puzzle whose solution remained tantalizingly out of reach. The incident with the horses changed everything. Catherine was crossing the main yard, arms full of clean laundry, when a sudden clap of thunder spooked the remuda. The horses, normally docile creatures, erupted into panicked motion, hooves churning dust and dangerous energy through the confined space. Thomas stood directly in their path, frozen by fear or surprise, his small wooden horse clutched in one hand. Without thinking, Catherine dropped the laundry and threw herself forward, wrapping her arms around the boy and rolling them both toward the safety of the corral fence as the horses thundered past. They lay in the dirt for a moment, breathing hard, Catherine's arms still wrapped protectively around Thomas's small body. She could feel his heart beating rapidly against her chest, could smell the soap and sunshine scent of his hair. For one disorienting moment, the sensation felt achingly familiar, as if she had held this child before. "Are you hurt?" she asked, checking him for injuries with hands that trembled slightly. Thomas shook his head, but his green eyes remained fixed on her face with an expression of wonder and confusion. "You saved me," he whispered. "Anyone would have done the same." "No," he said with quiet certainty. "Not anyone, but you." Samuel appeared, his face pale with concern as he took in the scene. "Thomas, are you injured?" "Miss Catherine saved me," the boy replied, still staring at her with that unsettling intensity. Samuel's gaze shifted to Catherine, and for a moment his careful control slipped, revealing something that might have been gratitude, or recognition, or perhaps just surprise at her quick action. "Thank you," he said simply, but the words carried weight beyond their simplicity. As Catherine brushed dust from her skirts and helped Thomas to his feet, she noticed him clutching his wooden horse even tighter, as if the incident had reminded him of something precious that needed protecting. The barn held the sweet scent of hay and the earthy musk of horses on the morning that changed everything. Catherine worked alone, mucking stalls with methodical precision that had become second nature after a month of ranch life. The repetitive work allowed her mind to wander, reflecting on how thoroughly her circumstances had transformed since leaving Denver's drawing rooms for Colorado's demanding landscape. Thomas appeared in the barn doorway like a shadow, given substance, his small wooden horse tucked safely in his shirt pocket, where it always resided. He often sought her out during quiet moments, their conversations growing longer and more comfortable as trust developed between them. Today, however, something different marked his demeanor, a nervous energy that spoke of important words requiring careful delivery. "Miss Catherine," he said, his voice barely audible above the gentle sounds of horses shifting in their stalls. "Yes, Thomas." He stepped closer, those remarkable green eyes fixed on her face with an intensity that had become familiar, yet remained unsettling. His small hands twisted together as if wrestling with invisible bonds that held back essential truths. "I need to tell you something," he whispered. "Something important." Catherine set aside her work and knelt to his level, recognizing the gravity in his young voice. "What is it, sweetheart?" The endearment slipped out naturally, surprising them both. Thomas's eyes widened, and for a moment his careful composure cracked to reveal something raw and hopeful. "You," he said, his voice growing stronger with each word. "You're her, you're my mama." The words hit Catherine like physical blows, stealing her breath and sending her heart racing. She stared at the boy, searching his face for signs of childish fantasy or confusion, but found only certainty in those familiar green eyes. "Thomas, I think you're mistaken," she managed, though her voice sounded strange to her own ears. "I'm not your mother." "Yes, you are," he insisted with quiet conviction. "I remember your smell, like flowers and soap. I remember your voice when you sang to me. I remember your hands." He reached out tentatively to touch her fingers. "Soft but strong, just like these." Catherine's world tilted dangerously. The boy's words awakened memories she had buried so deeply she had convinced herself they were merely painful dreams. A secret pregnancy, a difficult birth in a remote cabin, a baby she was told had died, whose small body she never saw, whose grave she never visited. "Where did you come from before the ranch?" she asked, her voice barely functioning. "A place in Denver where children stay when they have no families. But before that, I lived with a lady who wasn't really my mama but pretended to be. And before that," his voice grew distant, as if reaching for memories at the edge of understanding. "Before that, I was with you." Catherine's hands trembled as she studied his features more carefully. The shape of his eyes, the set of his shoulders, the way he tilted his head when thinking deeply, details that had seemed merely familiar now screamed recognition. "Thomas, when were you born?" "The lady who pretended to be my mama said it was November 15th, 5 years ago." The date crashed through Catherine's careful defenses, like water through a broken dam. November 15th. The day she had labored through endless hours of pain in a cabin hidden in the mountains. The day Doc Walsh had emerged from the birthing room, with solemn news of a son who had not survived the trauma of birth. "Miss Catherine," Thomas's voice carried concern as he watched tears she hadn't realized were falling stream down her cheeks. "Did I say something wrong?" Before she could respond, Samuel's voice echoed through the barn. "Thomas, where are you, boy?" Panic flashed across Thomas's face as he heard Samuel approaching. "Don't tell him I told you," he whispered urgently. "He gets upset when I talk about before. Please don't tell." Samuel appeared in the stall doorway, taking in the scene with sharp eyes that missed nothing. Catherine's tears, Thomas's guilty expression, the charged atmosphere between them. "What's going on here?" he demanded, his voice carrying the authority that brooked no deception. "Nothing, Senor Samuel," Thomas said quickly. "Miss Catherine was just helping me find something I dropped." Samuel's gaze shifted between them, clearly sensing undercurrents he couldn't quite identify. "Thomas, Maria needs help in the kitchen. Go." The boy fled without another word, leaving Catherine alone with Samuel's penetrating stare. She struggled to compose herself, wiping away tears and attempting to return to her work as if nothing extraordinary had occurred. "Miss Morrison," Samuel said quietly, "I think we need to talk." But Catherine was already moving toward the barn door, desperate for space to process Thomas's revelation and its impossible implications. As she stepped into the bright morning sunlight, one thought echoed through her mind with devastating clarity. If Thomas was telling the truth, then someone had stolen her child and allowed her to believe him dead for 5 long years. The question that terrified her most was whether Samuel Blackwood had been part of that conspiracy from the beginning. The confrontation came that evening, after the last ranch hand had finished supper and retreated to the bunkhouse. Catherine waited in the kitchen, her resolve hardened by hours of churning thoughts and mounting certainty. When Samuel entered for his customary cup of coffee, she was ready. "We need to discuss Thomas," she said without preamble. Samuel's hand paused halfway to the coffee pot. "What about him?" "He believes I'm his mother." The words hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire. Samuel set down his cup with deliberate care, his weathered face revealing nothing of his thoughts. Children sometimes form attachments, he said finally. Thomas has had a difficult past. He may be confused about. Don't, Catherine's voice cut through his careful explanation. Don't treat me like a fool, Mr. Blackwood. That boy knows things about me that no child could simply guess. Samuel moved to the window that overlooked the yard, his broad shoulders tense beneath his work shirt. What exactly did he tell you? Details about my appearance, my voice, my touch. Things a child would remember about his mother. Catherine's hands clenched in her lap. He gave me his birth date, Mr. Blackwood. November 15th, 5 years ago. The silence stretched between them like a taut rope, ready to snap. When Samuel finally turned from the window, his expression carried the weight of a man confronting truths he had hoped to keep buried. Miss Morrison, there are circumstances you don't understand. Complexities that... Then explain them to me. Catherine rose from her chair, her composure finally cracking under the pressure of suppressed emotion. I have a right to know if that child is my son. Your son? Samuel's voice sharpened. What son? The question forced Catherine to confront the secret she had guarded for 5 years. Taking a shaking breath, she began the story she had never told another living soul. 5 years ago, I became pregnant out of wedlock. The father was a young man who worked briefly on my father's estate, someone deemed entirely unsuitable by my family's standards. Her voice grew stronger as she continued. When my condition became undeniable, my father arranged for me to spend my confinement in a remote cabin, attended only by Dr. Edmund Walsh. Samuel's face had gone pale, but he remained silent. I labored for 18 hours, Catherine continued, her hands unconsciously moving to her abdomen. Dr. Walsh finally delivered a son, but he told me the baby had died during birth. He said the trauma was too great, that the child never drew breath. I never saw the body, never held him, never said goodbye. And you believed this? I was 18 years old, exhausted and heartbroken. Of course I believed it. Catherine's voice hardened. But if Thomas is telling the truth, if he really is my child, then Dr. Walsh lied to me. Someone took my baby and let me grieve for a son who wasn't dead. Samuel sank heavily into a chair, suddenly looking older than his years. Miss Morrison, I think you should know that I didn't adopt Thomas through normal channels. Catherine's heart began racing. What do you mean? 3 years ago, I was in Denver on business. I stopped by an orphanage to make a donation, something I do annually in memory of my late wife. The director mentioned a boy who had been causing problems, a child no one wanted because of his nightmares and behavioral difficulties. Thomas, he was 7 years old, small for his age, and terrified of everything and everyone. The director said he had been surrendered by a woman who claimed to be his aunt, but the paperwork was vague. No birth certificate, no family history, just a boy who needed a home. Catherine gripped the edge of the table. Did you investigate his background? I tried. The woman who surrendered him had given a false address. The name on the surrender papers led nowhere. It was as if Thomas had simply materialized without a past. But you took him anyway. Samuel's expression softened slightly. He reminded me of myself at that age, lost, afraid, needing someone to believe in him. My wife and I were never blessed with children. Miss Morrison, taking in Thomas filled a void I hadn't realized existed. Catherine studied his face, searching for signs of deception. Do you have the paperwork from his adoption? In my office safe, along with everything else related to his case. I want to see it. Samuel hesitated. Miss Morrison, even if Thomas is your biological son, you need to consider the implications. He's been my legal ward for 3 years. He's settled here, happy, secure. What purpose would it serve to disrupt that? The purpose of reuniting a mother with her stolen child. Catherine's voice rose despite her efforts at control. You're asking me to walk away from my son to preserve your comfort. I'm asking you to consider what's best for Thomas. What's best for Thomas is the truth. Catherine moved toward the door. "Show me those papers, Mr. Blackwood, tonight." As she reached for the handle, Samuel's voice stopped her. "Miss Morrison, there's something else you should know, something that might change your perspective on this situation." Catherine turned back, dreading what new revelation awaited. "Dr. Walsh has been to this ranch before. In fact, he's scheduled to visit again next month for his annual medical rounds." Samuel's eyes met hers. "If you're right about what happened 5 years ago, if Thomas really is your son, then Dr. Walsh knows exactly who he is and what he's done." The memories came flooding back with painful clarity as Catherine sat alone in her small room. Samuel's adoption papers spread before her on the wooden chest. The official documents told a sparse story. A boy surrendered to Denver's St. Mary's orphanage by one Elena Morrison, listed as his aunt, with no other family information provided. Elena Morrison. Catherine's heart constricted as she recognized the cruel irony. Someone had used a variation of her own name to abandon her child, creating a paper trail that led nowhere while keeping Thomas tantalizingly close to his true identity. The lamplight flickered across the pages as Catherine forced herself to remember those dark months 5 years ago. She had been 19, foolishly in love with David Hartwell, a young man who worked temporarily on her father's estate, managing livestock purchases. David possessed an easy smile, gentle hands with animals, and dreams of owning his own ranch someday. He also had no money, no family connections, and no understanding of the rigid social expectations that governed Catherine's world. Their romance had bloomed in stolen moments, conversations during her morning rides, shared lunches by the stream that bordered the property, evening meetings in the garden when the household slept. David spoke of a future where her father's approval wouldn't matter, where they could build something together based on love rather than obligation. Catherine, intoxicated by the novelty of choosing her own path, had believed every word. The pregnancy had terrified them both. David proposed marriage immediately, but Catherine's father discovered their relationship before any plans could be made. Harrison Morrison's rage had been swift and comprehensive. David was dismissed without references, his reputation destroyed through carefully placed words in the right circles. Catherine found herself confined to the estate while her father arranged a more permanent solution to their problem. The cabin where she spent her confinement sat 20 miles from Denver, hidden in a grove of aspen trees that whispered secrets to the wind. Miss Abernathy, a stern widow hired as her companion, maintained strict silence about their presence there. Dr. Edmund Walsh visited weekly to monitor Catherine's condition, his manner professional but cold. During those long months, Catherine had dreamed of her child constantly. She imagined a son with David's kind eyes, a daughter with her own stubborn spirit. She chose names, planned the stories she would tell, envisioned the love she would pour into this unexpected blessing. The baby represented hope for a different kind of life, one where her choices mattered more than her father's ambitions. The labor had been excruciating, lasting through an entire day and night while autumn wind rattled the cabin walls. Catherine remembered Dr. Walsh's tense voice calling for hot water, clean linens, prayers for mother and child. She remembered Mrs. Abernathy's nervous pacing, the way shadows danced on the ceiling, the sound of her own voice crying out for relief that seemed never to come. And then, suddenly, it was over. The room fell silent, except for Catherine's exhausted breathing and the distant sound of men's voices outside the cabin. Dr. Walsh emerged from behind the hanging sheet that had blocked her view, his face grave with practiced sorrow. "I'm sorry, Miss Morrison," he had said, his medical bag already packed as if eager to leave. The child did not survive the delivery. The trauma was too great for such a small body. Catherine had begged to see her baby, to hold him just once, but Dr. Walsh insisted it would only increase her suffering. "Better to remember the hope than to dwell on the loss," he had said, already moving toward the door. "Your father has arranged for proper burial. You need never think of this again." But she had thought of it every day for 5 years. The child who might have been, the love that could have grown, the future that died in that lonely cabin. She had returned to Denver pale and broken, accepting her father's plans for her recovery with numb compliance. The arranged marriage to Reginald Ashworth had seemed like fitting punishment for her foolish dreams. Now, staring at Thomas's adoption papers, Catherine understood the full scope of the deception. Her child hadn't died in that cabin. He had been taken, hidden away in an orphanage, given a false identity to prevent discovery. Dr. Walsh had been paid to lie, to steal her son and sell him to the highest bidder in the adoption market. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. "Miss Catherine?" Thomas's voice called through the door. "Are you all right? I saw your light was still on." Catherine quickly gathered the papers, her hands shaking with rage and grief. "I'm fine, Thomas. You should be sleeping." "I can't sleep. I keep thinking about what I told you in the bar." His voice carried the weight of secrets too heavy for such small shoulders. "Did I make you sad?" Catherine opened the door to find him standing in the hallway, his wooden horse clutched against his chest. In the lamplight, the resemblance to David Hartwell was unmistakable. The same gentle eyes, the same thoughtful expression, the same way of holding his head when uncertain. "No, sweetheart," she whispered, kneeling to his level. "You didn't make me sad. You gave me the greatest gift imaginable." The next morning brought Samuel's reluctant revelation in his private office, a sparse room that reflected the practical nature of its occupant. Catherine sat across from his desk while he retrieved additional documents from a locked drawer, his movements deliberate and heavy with the weight of truths he had hoped never to share. "I wasn't entirely honest last night," Samuel began, spreading papers before her with careful precision. "When I adopted Thomas, I suspected his background wasn't what it appeared to be." Catherine's pulse quickened as she examined the custody documents, birth records, and correspondence that painted a clearer picture of her son's journey from her arms to this remote ranch. The woman who surrendered him, this Elena Morrison, she was nervous, evasive about details. When I pressed for more information about Thomas's parents, she claimed they died in a typhoid outbreak, but couldn't provide dates or locations. Samuel's weathered hands gestured toward a particular letter. "I hired a private investigator to look into the matter. The investigator's report, dated 2 years ago, contained details that made Catherine's blood run cold. Elena Morrison had been identified as Mrs. Elena Hartwell, widow of one David Hartwell, who had died in a ranch accident in Wyoming, 18 months after leaving Denver. The woman had been caring for a child she claimed was her nephew, but neighbors reported inconsistencies in her story about the boy's origins. "David," Catherine whispered, his name a prayer and a curse on her lips. "He tried to find us," Samuel nodded grimly. "According to the report, Hartwell spent considerable time and money searching for a pregnant woman named Catherine Morrison. He believed his child had been hidden somewhere, possibly given up for adoption without his knowledge." Catherine's vision blurred as she absorbed the implications. While she had grieved for a dead baby, David had been searching for their living son. While she had accepted her father's lies, David had been fighting to uncover the truth. Elena Hartwell found Thomas in the Denver orphanage system through her husband's investigation, Samuel continued. "She took him in, believing he was David's child, but when her husband died, she couldn't afford to care him properly. So she brought him back to the orphanage, with a false name to protect his identity from whoever had originally hidden him there." Samuel's expression grew troubled. "Miss Morrison, your father's influence reaches far beyond Denver society." Mrs. Hartwell was frightened, convinced that powerful people wanted Thomas to disappear permanently. Catherine stared at the adoption papers, her father's shadow falling across every page. Harrison Morrison had orchestrated the entire deception, paying Dr. Walsh to steal her child, arranging for the boy's placement in an orphanage where he could be monitored and controlled. Even David's death seemed conveniently timed, removing the one person determined enough to keep searching for the truth. "Why didn't you tell me this when Thomas first spoke about his memories?" she asked. Samuel's hands clenched into fists on the desktop. "Because I was protecting him. And because I wasn't certain you weren't part of the original conspiracy. The accusation hit Catherine like a physical blow. You thought I was working with my father? Your arrival here seemed too convenient. A woman from the Morrison family, sent specifically to this ranch, just as Thomas was beginning to remember more about his past. Samuel's eyes met hers with stark honesty. I've spent 3 years keeping that boy safe from people who wanted him to disappear. I wasn't going to hand him over to someone who might be here to finish the job. Catherine understood his suspicion, even as it wounded her. And now I see the way you look at him, the way he responds to you. Children don't lie about love, Miss Morrison. Thomas knows who you are in ways that can't be faked or coached. A soft knock interrupted their conversation. Maria entered carrying a tea service, her usual morning routine proceeding despite the extraordinary circumstances unfolding in the office. Pardon, Senor Samuel, but Thomas, he asks if Miss Catherine is sick. He says she looks sad this morning. Catherine's heart ached at the evidence of her son's concern. Even now, he was protecting her, watching over her with the instinctive care of a child who had learned too early that people he loved could disappear without warning. Tell him I'm fine, Maria. Just tired from working hard. Maria nodded, but lingered in the doorway. Senor Samuel, the boy, he is different since Miss Catherine comes here. More happy, more, how do you say, complete. After Maria left, Samuel gathered the papers with careful deliberation. Miss Morrison, I need you to understand something. Thomas is my son now, legally and in every way that matters. I won't let anyone hurt him, including you. I would never hurt him. Not intentionally, perhaps. But you're talking about disrupting the only stable life he's ever known. You're asking me to trust that your love is stronger than your father's power. Catherine met his gaze steadily. Thomas is my child, Mr. Blackwood. My father stole 5 years of his life from me. I won't let him steal the rest. Catherine's clandestine search of Samuel's office occurred 3 nights later, driven by a desperate need for more evidence to confirm what her heart already knew. The moon provided just enough light through the window to navigate the familiar space without a lamp that might alert the household to her activities. Samuel kept his important papers in a locked desk drawer, but Catherine's childhood had included enough mischief to teach her basic lockpicking skills. The mechanism yielded after several tense minutes of careful manipulation with a hairpin, revealing a treasure trove of correspondence that painted a disturbing picture of conspiracy and corruption. The first letters were routine business communications, but deeper in the drawer, Catherine found correspondence that made her blood run cold. Telegraph messages between her father and various contacts in Denver, dated from the time of Thomas's birth, outlined a systematic plan to dispose of her problem permanently. One telegram, signed with her father's initials, read, "Package delivered successfully to Walsh. Ensure no future complications arise. Payment as agreed." Another, sent 3 days later, "Inform all parties matter resolved permanently. No records to remain." But most damning was a letter from Walsh wiped his brow with a handkerchief that trembled in his shaking hands. "I had no control over that situation. By then, the boy was in the orphanage system, protected by anonymity and false records. Protected or hidden? Both, I suppose." Walsh looked around the barn as if seeing it for the first time. "How did he end up here? How did you find him?" "I didn't find him," Catherine said. "He found me." Children don't forget their mothers, Dr. Walsh, no matter how young they are when separated. Walsh reached into his medical bag, and Samuel stepped forward, his hand moving to his weapon. But the doctor only withdrew a leather journal, its pages filled with careful handwriting. "I've kept records," Walsh said quietly. "Everything. Names, dates, payments received. I told myself it was for medical purposes, but the truth is, I needed proof of what I'd done. Insurance against men like your father, who destroy anyone who becomes inconvenient. Catherine stared at the journal, recognizing it as potential salvation for Thomas and evidence to destroy her father's carefully constructed lies. "Why?" she asked. "Why keep records if you were trying to hide what you'd done?" Walsh's laugh held no humor. "Because I knew this day would come eventually. Secrets like this don't stay buried forever, Miss Morrison. They grow in the darkness until they consume everything around them." The evenings that followed, Walsh's confession brought a tentative peace to the ranch, as if the revelation of long-buried truths had somehow lightened the very air around them. Catherine found herself free to openly express the maternal love that had been growing stronger with each passing day, while Thomas gradually emerged from the shell of careful silence he had maintained for so long. They sat together on the porch steps after supper, Catherine's hands busy with needle and thread as she worked on a quilt that had taken shape almost without conscious planning. The pattern emerging under her fingers, interlocking rings in shades of blue and gold, seemed to create itself, each piece finding its proper place through instinct rather than design. Thomas carved at a piece of pine with the small knife Samuel had given him, creating another in the series of wooden animals that had become his specialty. His current project appeared to be a horse, its proportions carefully measured to match the treasured toy he still carried everywhere. "Will you tell me about my father?" Thomas asked quietly, not looking up from his carving. Catherine's needle paused in its steady rhythm. "What would you like to know? Was he kind? Did he love me before I was born?" The questions pierced Catherine's heart with their simple honesty. "He was the kindest man I ever knew. He had gentle hands with animals, a laugh that made everyone around him smile, and dreams of building something beautiful and lasting. Like this ranch? Very much like this ranch. He wanted to create a place where families could grow and thrive, where children could run free and safe." Catherine's voice grew soft with memory. "He talked about the house we would build together, the horses we would raise, the garden where our children would play." Thomas set down his carving and looked at her directly. "Why didn't he come for us?" "He tried, sweetheart. After my father sent him away, your father spent years searching for us. He never stopped believing that you were alive, never stopped trying to find where we had been hidden. He died before he could find us." Catherine nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. The unfairness of it all, David's death just when he was closest to uncovering the truth, felt like a weight that would never fully lift. "I think he knows now, though," Thomas said with the matter-of-fact wisdom that sometimes surprised her. "I think he's glad we found each other." Samuel emerged from the barn, his evening chores completed, and joined them on the porch. Over the past weeks, his initial suspicion had gradually given way to something approaching acceptance, though Catherine sensed he still struggled with the implications of their reunion. "That's fine work," he said, examining Thomas's carving. "Your father would be proud of your skill." Thomas beamed under the praise, his small chest swelling with obvious pride. "Miss Catherine says he was good with his hands too." "All the best ranchers are," Samuel replied. "It's not enough to know about cattle and crops. You have to be able to build, repair, create whatever the land requires." Catherine watched the interaction between the two most important men in Thomas's life, noting the easy affection that had developed, despite the complex circumstances. Samuel had become more than a guardian to the boy. He was a true father figure, providing the steady masculine influence that Thomas desperately needed. "Samuel," Catherine said carefully, "I want you to know that I don't expect anything to change between you and Thomas. You've given him a home, a family, a future. I would never want to disrupt that." Samuel studied her face in the growing twilight. "What are you saying, Miss Morrison?" "I'm saying that maybe there's room for all of us in Thomas's life. He needs his mother, but he also needs you. This ranch is his home now. These people are his family." Thomas looked between them with sudden understanding. "You mean you would stay here? You wouldn't take me away?" "I would stay if Mr. Blackwood would allow it," Catherine said. "This is where you belong, Thomas. This is where you're happy." Samuel was quiet for a long moment, his weathered hands folded in his lap as he considered her words. It wouldn't be a conventional arrangement. he said finally. Nothing about our situation has been conventional. The neighbors would talk. A single woman living on a ranch with a bachelor rancher and his adopted son. Catherine felt her cheeks warm but kept her voice steady. People will always find reasons to gossip, Mr. Blackwood. The question is whether we care more about their opinions than about Thomas's welfare. Thomas suddenly stood up, his wooden horse clutched in one hand and his carving knife in the other. I want both of you, he declared with the fierce certainty of a child who had learned not to take love for granted. I want my mama and I want Samuel, and I want to live here where everything makes sense. Samuel's expression softened as he looked at the boy who had become the center of his world. Well then, he said quietly, I suppose we'll have to figure out how to make that work. As if summoned by their conversation, Maria appeared in the doorway carrying a tray of hot chocolate and her knowing smile. Senor Samuel, she said, settling the tray on a nearby table. I think maybe you should ask Miss Catherine the important question. The dust cloud on the horizon appeared 3 days later, heralding an arrival that Catherine had both dreaded and expected since her confrontation with Dr. Walsh. She watched from the kitchen window as an elegant carriage drawn by matched bay horses approached the ranch, flanked by 2 riders whose bearings suggested official business rather than social calling. Harrison Morrison had come to reclaim his wayward daughter. Samuel stood beside her, his jaw set in the grim lines she had learned to recognize as his preparation for battle. How many men? My father, 2 riders who are probably his lawyers, and the driver. Catherine's voice remained steady despite the fear coursing through her veins. He won't come alone when he's planning to enforce his will. Thomas is helping Miguel repair fence in the south pasture. They won't return for hours. Catherine nodded gratefully. Whatever confrontation awaited, at least her son would be spared witnessing it direct. The carriage pulled up before the main house with theatrical precision, and Harrison Morrison emerged like a patriarch from an Old Testament story. Tall, silver-haired, radiating the kind of authority that came from decades of having his orders obeyed without question. His traveling clothes were immaculate, despite the dusty journey, and his pale eyes swept the ranch buildings with obvious distaste. The 2 men who flanked him wore the dark suits and calculating expressions of legal professionals accustomed to wielding contracts and court orders as weapons. One carried a leather portfolio that undoubtedly contained documents designed to compel Catherine's immediate return to Denver. Catherine stepped onto the porch to meet them, her spine straight and her chin raised in unconscious echo of her father's own commanding bearing. Behind her, Samuel's presence provided both comfort and strength, though she knew his support might ultimately prove insufficient against her father's resources. Catherine, Harrison's voice carried the chill of a Colorado winter. I trust you've learned the lessons I intended during your employment here. I've learned a great deal, Father. Perhaps more than you intended. Harrison's eyes narrowed at the subtle defiance in her tone. Then you'll understand why your immediate return to Denver is necessary. Ashworth has been remarkably patient about the delayed wedding arrangements, but his patience has limits. Reginald Ashworth will have to find another bride, Father. I will not marry him. You will marry whom I choose, when I choose, or face consequences you cannot imagine. Harrison gestured toward the legal representatives. Gentlemen, please explain Miss Morrison's situation to her. The elder lawyer stepped forward, unfolding an official document with practiced ceremony. Miss Morrison, you are hereby commanded to return to Denver immediately to answer charges of breach of contract, abandonment of financial obligations, and willful destruction of property. Failure to comply will result in criminal prosecution and potential imprisonment. Catherine stared at the document, recognizing her father's tactical brilliance. By framing her defiance in legal terms, he had created justification for forced compliance while maintaining his public image as a reasonable man dealing with an unruly daughter. What financial obligation? What property? The substantial expenses incurred in arranging your marriage, the damage to Mr. Ashworth's reputation and business prospects, the cost of your rehabilitation here. The lawyer's tone suggested these charges were both serious and ironclad. The total amount exceeds $15,000. Samuel stepped forward, his voice carrying dangerous undertones. This is extortion, not legal process. Harrison finally acknowledged Samuel's presence with a look of withering contempt. Mr. Blackwood, I presume your unauthorized interference in family matters has already caused considerable difficulty. I strongly advise against further involvement. Miss Morrison is under my protection while she remains on this property. Miss Morrison is under my authority until she reaches the age of 25 or enters into marriage with my approval. Harrison's smile held no warmth. Neither condition has been met. Catherine felt the trap closing around her with the precision of her father's careful planning. In 1880s Colorado, an unmarried woman remained legally subject to her father's will regardless of her personal desires. Her only escape would be marriage to a man of Harrison's choosing, or independence that required resources she didn't possess. However, Harrison continued, his voice taking on the reasonable tone that had served him well in political negotiations, I am prepared to be generous. Return with me now, marry Mr. Ashworth as planned, and these charges will disappear. Your indiscretions will be forgotten, your reputation restored. And if I refuse, then you will discover that my influence extends far beyond Denver society. This ranch's debts, Mr. Blackwood's questionable past, the boy's irregular adoption, all subjects that might interest federal authorities. The threat hung in the air like smoke from a powder charge. Catherine realized her father had researched every aspect of the ranch's operations, every vulnerability that might be exploited to ensure her compliance. Samuel's hand moved instinctively toward his weapon, but Catherine touched his arm gently, recognizing that violence would only give her father additional ammunition. You're threatening innocent people to force my obedience. I'm protecting my family's interests by any means necessary, Harrison replied. The choice is yours, Catherine. Return willingly, or watch everything and everyone you've come to care about suffer the consequences of your continued defiance. Harrison Morrison's ultimatum hung over the ranch like a thundercloud ready to break. Catherine had until sunrise to decide: return to Denver and accept the marriage to Reginald Ashworth, or watch her father destroy everyone who had given her sanctuary and love. Samuel spent the evening making preparations with the grim efficiency of a soldier preparing for siege. He dispatched riders to alert friendly neighbors, sent messages to the territorial sheriff, and secured important documents in places where they might survive whatever legal assault Harrison might unleash. Catherine found him in his office after midnight, studying a discharge paper yellowed with age and bearing official military seals. The document that had haunted him for years now lay exposed on his desk like a wound reluctantly opened to air and light. Disobeying a direct order, Samuel said without looking up, refusing to participate in the massacre of unarmed civilians. That's what cost me my military career and branded me as unreliable in the eyes of federal authorities. Catherine examined the document, noting the formal language that transformed moral courage into military disgrace. You saved innocent lives. I lost my rank, my pension, my reputation. Your father's investigators found this record and understand exactly how to use it against me. Samuel's voice carried bitter experience. A disgraced soldier running an unlicensed adoption is hardly the kind of man territorial judges trust with children's welfare. Thomas isn't unlicensed. You have legal custody, obtained through irregular channels, with documentation that won't survive serious scrutiny. Your father can make a compelling case that Thomas belongs in proper institutional care rather than with a man of questionable character. The implications struck Catherine with devastating force. Her father hadn't just threatened Samuel's livelihood, he had found the one weapon that could separate her from Thomas permanently. There has to be another way. Samuel finally looked at her, his weathered face showing every one of his years. There is, but you won't like it. Tell me. Marriage changes everything. A married woman is no longer subject to her father's authority. Her husband becomes her legal guardian, and children become part of that protection. Catherine stared at him, understanding dawning slowly. You're proposing marriage of convenience. I'm proposing survival, Miss Morrison. For Thomas, for you, for everyone on this ranch. Samuel's voice carried no emotion, as if he were discussing livestock purchases, rather than a life-altering decision. Your father's power derives from your legal status as his unmarried daughter. Marriage to me would eliminate that advantage. And Thomas would have both his mother and legal father under one roof, with all the protections that provides. Samuel stood and moved to the window that overlooked the sleeping ranch. It's not what either of us planned, but it would give Thomas the family he deserves. Catherine joined him at the window, noting how the moonlight transformed the familiar landscape into something mysterious and beautiful. What about love, Samuel? What about the kind of marriage where two people choose each other freely? Love is a luxury people like us can't always afford. Sometimes survival and security have to be enough. Is that what your first marriage was like? Samuel's expression softened slightly. No, Ellen and I married for love, built dreams together, believed we could conquer anything as long as we faced it united. His voice grew quiet. She died in childbirth along with our son. I learned that love alone isn't always strong enough to protect the people who matter most. Catherine felt tears sting her eyes at the raw pain in his voice. I'm sorry. I didn't know. It's why Thomas means so much to me. He gave me a second chance to be a father, to build something lasting. Samuel turned to face her directly. I won't let your father take that away. Not from me, and not from you. The sound of approaching hoofbeats interrupted their conversation. Through the window they saw Thomas and Miguel riding hard toward the ranch house, their urgency suggesting trouble beyond the normal challenges of fence repair. Samuel grabbed his rifle from the gun rack as they rushed outside to meet the returning riders. Thomas slid from his horse before it had fully stopped, his young face pale with exhaustion and fear. Samuel, Miss Catherine, there are men watching the run. Miguel saw them on the ridge above the south pasture. Miguel nodded grimly as he dismounted. Armed men, Samuel. Professional types, not local cowboys. They've been watching us work all afternoon. Catherine's blood ran cold as she realized her father's strategy had evolved beyond legal threats. How many men? At least 6, that I could see, Miguel replied. Maybe more hidden in the rocks. Samuel's expression hardened into the mask of a warrior preparing for battle. He's not planning to wait until morning. He's going to force the issue tonight. Thomas looked between the adults, his intuitive understanding grasping the danger even if he couldn't comprehend all the details. Are they coming for me? Catherine knelt beside her son, gathering him into her arms with fierce protectiveness. No one is taking you anywhere, Thomas. I promise. But even as she spoke the words, Catherine wondered if love and determination would prove strong enough against her father's wealth, influence, and ruthless determination to control every aspect of his family's future. The plan took shape in the pre-dawn darkness, forged from desperation and the kind of courage that emerges when everything worth protecting hangs in the balance. Samuel spread a hand-drawn map of the surrounding territory across the kitchen table, while Maria prepared coffee strong enough to sustain them through whatever trials awaited. The county courthouse is in Cedar Falls, 20 miles east, Samuel explained, his finger tracing the route through mountain passes and river crossings. Judge Pemberton holds court every Thursday morning. If we can get there before your father's lawyers arrive, we might have a chance. Catherine studied the property deed that Samuel had retrieved from his safe, the document that proved his clear ownership of the ranch and provided some legal foundation for their planned resistance. Will Judge Pemberton listen to us? My father's influence reaches far beyond Denver. Pemberton's an honest man elected by local ranchers and miners rather than appointed by territorial politicians. He's presided over my adoption of Thomas, witnessed my character for 3 years. Samuel's voice carried measured hope. If anyone will give us a fair hearing, it's him. Thomas sat quietly at the table, his wooden horse clutched in both hands as he absorbed the gravity of their situation. Though only 10 years old, he understood that adults were planning to fight for his future, and his young face reflected both fear and determination. "What about the men watching the ranch?" Miguel asked from his position by the window, where he maintained vigilant surveillance of the surrounding darkness. "We leave before dawn, use the old mining trail through Devil's Canyon. It's rough going, but it will keep us away from the main roads where your father's men might intercept us." Samuel folded the map with military precision. "Maria, you and Elena will stay here. Maintain normal routine. If anyone asks, Miss Catherine and Thomas are sick with fever and can't receive visitors." Maria nodded, her expression fierce with protective loyalty. "Señor Samuel, you be careful. That man, he has much power and little conscience." Catherine gathered the evidence they had compiled: Doc Walsh's confession, the adoption papers correspondence proving her father's conspiracy to steal Thomas. Each document represented a piece of the truth that had been hidden for 5 years, fragments of justice finally assembled into a coherent case. "There's something else we need to consider," Samuel said quietly, his gaze meeting Catherine's with steady resolve. "If we're going to present ourselves to Judge Pemberton as a family unit, with both parents claiming custody of Thomas, we need to make that legal relationship official." Catherine's heart skipped as she understood his meaning. "You want us to marry before we go to court?" "It's the strongest possible legal foundation for our case. A married couple with documented ownership of property, established residency, and 3 years of successful child-rearing." Samuel's tone remained practical, but she detected something deeper in his voice. "Judge Pemberton can perform the ceremony before hearing our case." Thomas looked up from his wooden horse, his green eyes bright with sudden hope. "You mean you'd really be my parents? Both of you officially? If that's what you want, son?" Samuel replied, using the paternal address that came naturally despite their complex circumstances. "It's what I've wanted since Miss Catherine first came here," Thomas said with the simple honesty that characterized all his important statements. Catherine felt the rightness of the decision settling around her like a warm cloak. Marriage to Samuel might not be born of romantic love, but it was founded on mutual respect, shared devotion to Thomas, and the kind of partnership that could weather any storm her father might unleash. "Then we'd better get started," she said, amazed by the steadiness of her own voice. "How long will it take to reach the courthouse?" 4 hours if we push hard and the weather holds." Samuel moved to the gun cabinet, selecting weapons and ammunition with practiced efficiency. "We'll leave in 1 hour. Travel light. Stay off the main trails." As the household made final preparations, Catherine found herself alone with Thomas for a moment in her small room. She helped him gather a few treasured possessions: his wooden horse, a book Samuel had given him, the small knife he used for carving. "Are you scared?" Thomas asked as she tucked his belongings into a travel pack. "Terrified," Catherine admitted, "but also hopeful. For the first time in 5 years, I believe we might actually win." Thomas wrapped his thin arms around her waist, holding her with the desperate strength of a child who had learned not to take love for granted. "Whatever happens, I'm glad I found you again, Mama." The word hit Catherine like a benediction, washing away years of grief and regret. Whatever challenges awaited them in Cedar Falls, whatever weapons her father might deploy against their fragile hope, she would face them knowing that her son had finally spoken the name she had dreamed of hearing for 5 long years. Outside, Samuel loaded their horses with supplies for the dangerous journey ahead, while Miguel kept watch for any sign that Harrison Morrison's patience had reached its end. The Cedar Falls courthouse stood like a fortress of weathered stone against the morning sky, its imposing columns and territorial flag representing the last hope for justice in a territory where money and influence often trumped truth. Catherine clutched Thomas's hand as they climbed the steps, their travel-stained clothes and dust-covered faces marking them as people who had ridden hard through dangerous country to reach this moment. Judge William Pemberton proved to be a man whose weathered features and calloused hands spoke of personal understanding of frontier hardships. His chambers occupied a corner of the courthouse where law books competed for space, with maps of the territory and photographs of the families whose disputes he had settled over the years. "Mr. Blackwood," Judge Pemberton said, rising from behind his desk with genuine warmth, "I received your message about urgent custody matters. I trust you and the boy are well." "Thank you, Your Honor. We're all well, though we face serious challenges." Samuel gestured toward Catherine and Thomas. "I believe you remember Thomas from his adoption proceedings 3 years ago." "Indeed I do. A fine boy who's obviously thrived under your care." Judge Pemberton's keen eyes studied Catherine with professional interest. "And this would be Miss Catherine Morrison, Your Honor, Thomas's biological mother." The simple statement hung in the air like thunder before lightning. Judge Pemberton's expression shifted from cordial interest to sharp attention as he absorbed the implications of their presence in his chambers. "Miss Morrison, that's a serious claim. Do you have evidence to support it?" Catherine opened the leather portfolio containing Walsh's confession, the adoption records, and her father's incriminating correspondence. "Substantial evidence, Your Honor. Evidence of conspiracy, fraud, and the illegal separation of a mother from her child." Judge Pemberton examined each document with the careful attention of a man accustomed to weighing evidence and determining truth from testimony. His expression grew increasingly grave as he read Walsh's detailed confession and studied the timeline of Thomas's journey from Catherine's arms to Samuel's ranch. "These are extraordinary allegations, Miss Morrison. You're claiming that prominent Denver citizens conspired to steal your child and falsify his death. I'm claiming that my father valued his political reputation more than his grandson's welfare, and found accomplices willing to participate in kidnapping for the right price." Thomas had remained quietly attentive throughout the legal discussion, but now he stepped forward with the serious demeanor of someone much older than his 10 years. "Your Honor," he said, his clear voice carrying surprising authority, "I remember her. I remember Miss Catherine from before the bad place where they kept me. She sang to me, and her hands smelled like flowers." Judge Pemberton leaned forward, his attention fully focused on the boy whose testimony might prove more compelling than any written evidence. "Thomas, do you understand what's happening here today?" "Yes, sir. People are trying to decide if Miss Catherine is really my mama, and if Samuel can keep being my papa." Thomas's green eyes reflected both intelligence and determination. "I want them both, Your Honor. I want to stay with Samuel on the ranch, but I want Miss Catherine to be my mama too. And if you had to choose between them—" Thomas looked stricken by the question, his small hand reaching automatically for the wooden horse in his pocket. "I don't want to choose. Samuel saved me from the lonely place, but Miss Catherine is the mama I remembered in my dreams." Judge Pemberton's expression softened at the boy's obvious distress. "You may not have to choose, son. But first, I need to understand the legal situation fully." Samuel stepped forward, his hat held respectfully in his hands. "Your Honor, Miss Morrison and I would like to request that you perform a marriage ceremony before hearing our custody case." "Marriage?" Judge Pemberton's eyebrows rose in surprise. "Mr. Blackwood, that's highly irregular." "Perhaps, but it would provide the strongest possible legal foundation for our family unit. Miss Morrison has been living on my ranch for 2 months, helping to care for Thomas and integrate into our household. Marriage would formalize the relationship and provide legal protection against external interference." Catherine found her voice, though it trembled slightly with nervousness. "Your Honor, I know this arrangement appears sudden, but it's based on mutual respect, shared devotion to Thomas, and the kind of partnership that creates stable homes for children." Judge Pemberton studied the 3 of them, the determined woman, the steady man, and the boy who watched their faces with anxious hope. "Miss Morrison, are you entering this marriage of your own free will without coercion or undue influence?" "Yes, Your Honor. This is my choice, made in Thomas's best interests and my own." "Mr. Blackwood, do you understand the responsibilities you're accepting by marrying Miss Morrison and formally acknowledging Thomas as your stepson?" I've been Thomas's father in every way that matters for 3 years, Your Honor. Marriage to Miss Morrison simply makes official what already exists in our hearts. Judge Pemberton was quiet for a long moment, weighing the unusual request against the obvious sincerity of their commitment to Thomas's welfare. Very well, he said finally. I'll perform the ceremony, but I want it clearly understood that this marriage must be entered into with the same seriousness as any other, regardless of the circumstances that brought you together. The marriage ceremony proceeded with simple dignity in Judge Pemberton's chambers, witnessed by his clerk and the afternoon sunlight streaming through tall windows. Catherine wore her best traveling dress, still dusty from their hard ride, but cleaned and pressed as well as circumstances allowed. Samuel had managed to find a clean shirt and had even attempted to tame his unruly hair, though the effort proved only partially successful. Thomas stood between them as Judge Pemberton read the traditional vows, his small hand resting on the wooden gavel that had become the symbol of their hoped-for justice. The boy's presence transformed what might have been a cold legal arrangement into something deeper, a true joining of 3 people who had chosen to become family despite circumstances that would have defeated lesser spirit. Do Samuel Blackwood take Catherine Morrison to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, for better or worse, for as long as you both shall live? Samuel's voice carried steady conviction as he replied, I do, his weathered hands gentle as they held Catherine's smaller ones. Do you, Catherine Morrison, take Samuel Blackwood to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, for better or worse, for as long as you both shall live? Catherine met Samuel's gaze directly, seeing past the practical nature of their union to the genuine respect and growing affection that had developed between them. I do. By the power vested in me by the territory of Colorado, I now pronounce you husband and wife. Judge Pemberton's smile held warmth as he added, You may kiss the bride, Mr. Blackwood. The kiss was brief and gentle, more promise than passion, but it carried the weight of commitment freely given. Thomas clapped his hands with obvious delight, his joy at their union momentarily overcoming the gravity of their legal situation. The celebration proved short-lived as commotion in the courthouse corridor announced the arrival of Harrison Morrison and his legal entourage. The sound of expensive boots on wooden floors, urgent whispered conferences, and the rustle of important papers signaled that Catherine's father had finally tracked them to their sanctuary. Judge Pemberton's expression hardened as he heard the disturbance. It appears we'll be moving directly to the custody hearing. Are you prepared for what's coming? Catherine squared her shoulders, drawing strength from Samuel's presence beside her and Thomas's trusting hand in hers. We're ready, Your Honor. The formal courtroom felt cavernous after the intimacy of the judge's chambers. Harrison Morrison entered like a conquering general, flanked by 3 lawyers whose expensive suits and calculating expressions marked them as specialists in getting powerful men whatever they wanted. Behind them came 2 witnesses, stern-faced individuals whose purpose Catherine couldn't immediately discern. Harrison's cold gaze swept over his daughter's changed appearance, the simple gold band now adorning her finger, and the obvious unity of the small family group facing him across the courtroom. Your Honor, Harrison's lead attorney began before Judge Pemberton had even settled behind the bench. We object to these irregular proceedings. Miss Morrison is not legally competent to enter into marriage contracts, having been declared mentally unstable by qualified physicians. Catherine felt her heart stop as papers were presented to Judge Pemberton. Documents bearing official seals and medical testimony that painted her as unfit for marriage or motherhood. Furthermore, the attorney continued, the child in question is not Catherine Morrison's biological son, but rather an orphan of unknown parentage who has been exploited by these individuals for financial gain. Walsh stepped forward from among Harrison's witnesses, his face pale but his voice steady as he prepared to betray everything he had confessed just days earlier. Your Honor, I delivered Miss Morrison's child 5 years ago. The infant was severely deformed and died within minutes of birth. I can provide medical records documenting the tragedy. Catherine stared at the man who had stolen her son, now prepared to perjure himself to complete her father's destruction of their family. The betrayal felt like a physical blow, stealing her breath and threatening to shatter her hard-won composure. Samuel stepped protectively closer, his hand finding her elbow in a gesture of support that didn't go unnoticed by Judge Pemberton. "Your Honor," Samuel said, his voice carrying the authority of a man who had faced enemy fire and survived, "Dr. Walsh is lying under oath. We have his written confession detailing the entire conspiracy to separate Miss Morrison from her child." Harrison's attorney smiled coldly. "Miss Blackwood, are you referring to this document?" He produced Dr. Walsh's journal, the same leather-bound book they had counted on as their primary evidence. Walsh has explained that these notes were fabricated, under duress, extracted through threats and coercion by desperate individuals attempting to legitimize their illegal custody of an orphaned child. Judge Pemberton accepted the journal, comparing it with the copy Catherine had made. His expression grew troubled as he noted discrepancies between the two versions, subtle alterations that transformed confession into accusation, truth into lies. The trap had been sprung with devastating precision. Harrison Morrison had anticipated their every move, corrupted their evidence, and positioned his daughter for final defeat in the very courthouse where she had hoped to find justice. The moment when everything changed came not from the adults, locked in legal battle, but from Thomas himself. As Judge Pemberton examined the conflicting evidence and Harrison Morrison's lawyers pressed their advantage, the 10-year-old boy stepped forward with quiet determination. "Your Honor," Thomas said, his clear voice cutting through the contentious atmosphere. "May I speak?" Judge Pemberton looked down at the small figure standing between the opposing forces with obvious courage despite his size. "This is highly irregular, son, but given the nature of the case, I'll allow it." Thomas reached into his pocket and withdrew his treasured wooden horse, holding it carefully in both hands as he approached the bench. "Dr. Walsh is lying, Your Honor. I rhyme him from before." Dr. Walsh's face went pale as Thomas continued, his young voice steady with conviction. "He came to the place where the lady who pretended to be my mama lived. He gave her money and took me away. I was scared and I hid under the bed. But I heard them talking." Thomas, Harrison Morrison's attorney, interrupted. "Children often confuse dreams with memories, especially children who have experienced trauma." "I'm not confused," Thomas replied with dignity that silenced the lawyer. "Walsh told the lady that my real mama thought I was dead, and it had to stay that way or bad things would happen to everyone." Judge Pemberton leaned forward, his attention fully focused on the boy's testimony. "Thomas, are you certain about what you heard?" "Yes, sir." Dr. Walsh said, "My grandfather was a powerful man who didn't want anyone to know I was alive. He said if my real mama ever found me, my grandfather would make sure I disappeared for good." The courtroom fell silent as the implications of Thomas's words settled over everyone present. Even Harrison Morrison's lawyers seemed shaken by the child's direct accusation. Dr. Walsh stepped forward desperately. "Your Honor, the boy is clearly repeating stories he's been coached to tell. This is exactly the kind of manipulation." "I wasn't coached," Thomas interrupted, his green eyes flashing with rare anger. "And I can prove it." Before anyone could stop him, Thomas opened his wooden horse with a careful twist that revealed it to be hollow inside. From the hidden compartment, he withdrew a small piece of paper, yellowed with age and bearing words, written in a child's careful printing. "I wrote this when I was little, before Dr. Walsh took me away the second time. The lady who pretended to be my mama taught me to read and write, and I wanted to remember my real mama's name so I could find her someday." Judge Pemberton accepted the paper with gentle hands, reading aloud the words that had been hidden for years. "My mama's name is Catherine. She smells like flowers and has soft hands. Dr. Walsh says she thinks I'm dead, but that's not true. I'm going to find her when I'm big enough." The simple honesty of a child's handwriting accomplished what all the legal maneuvering and conflicting testimonies could not. Judge Pemberton's expression hardened as he looked at Dr. Walsh, then at Harrison Morrison, finally understanding the scope of the conspiracy they had maintained for 5 years. "Walsh," Judge Pemberton said, his voice carrying the authority of moral outrage, "I'm going to ask you one more time, under oath and penalty of perjury. Is Thomas Morrison Blackwood the biological son of Catherine Morrison?" Walsh looked desperately toward Harrison Morrison, seeking guidance that didn't come. Harrison sat rigid in his chair, his carefully constructed facade finally cracking under the weight of his grandson's innocent truth. "Answer the question, Doctor," Judge Pemberton commanded. "Yes," Walsh whispered, his voice barely audible. "Yes, Thomas is Catherine Morrison's biological son." The admission rippled through the courtroom like water through a broken dam. Harrison Morrison's lawyers huddled in urgent consultation, while Catherine felt tears of vindication streaming down her cheeks. Samuel placed his arm around his new wife's shoulders as Thomas ran to their embrace, the wooden horse clutched triumphantly in his small hands. Judge Pemberton's gavel fell with the finality of justice long delayed. In light of new evidence and testimony, this court recognizes the legal marriage of Samuel and Catherine Blackwood, affirms their joint custody of Thomas Morrison Blackwood, and orders all charges against the defendants dismissed. Harrison Morrison rose slowly from his chair, his face a mask of controlled fury as he watched his carefully laid plans crumble around him. "This isn't over, Catherine," he said quietly, his voice carrying promises of future retribution. "Yes, it is," Catherine replied, her voice strong with new confidence. "Thomas is home now, where he belongs, with his family." As the Morrison party filed out of the courtroom in defeat, Judge Pemberton approached the reunited family with something approaching wonder. "Miss Blackwood," he said, using Catherine's new name with obvious pleasure, "I've presided over many custody cases, but I've never seen a child fight so bravely for his own future. You've raised an extraordinary young man." Thomas beamed under the praise, his ordeal finally over, his family finally complete and legally protected. The simple gold band on Catherine's finger caught the afternoon sunlight streaming through the courthouse windows, reflecting light like a beacon of hope fulfilled. 1 year later, the Blackwood Ranch had transformed into something even more beautiful than Margaret's original vision. Catherine stood in the garden she now tended alongside Samuel, watching Thomas help Miguel repair a section of fence with the competent hands of a boy who had found his place in the world. The morning light caught the simple gold band on her finger, the same ring Judge Pemberton had blessed in that Cedar Falls courtroom where their unconventional family had fought for its right to exist. What had begun as a marriage of convenience had deepened into something neither she nor Samuel had expected: genuine partnership, mutual respect, and the kind of love that grows from shared struggle and common purpose. Thomas had grown 3 inches in the past year, his face losing some of its childish roundness, while retaining the gentle expression that marked him as David Hartwell's son. The wooden horse remained his treasured possession, but now it shared space in his pockets with a new carving knife and small projects he worked on during quiet evening hours. "Mama," he called from across the yard, using the name that still sent warm joy through Catherine's heart. "Samuel says if I finish the fence work early, we can ride up to Eagles Peak this afternoon." "Only if your schoolwork is completed first," Catherine replied, noting the way Samuel smiled at her maternal insistence on education alongside practical skill. The tutoring arrangement with the retired school teacher in Cedar Falls had proven successful, giving Thomas access to formal learning while allowing him to remain on the ranch he loved. His quick mind absorbed knowledge hungrily, and Catherine often found him reading by lamplight long after his official bedtime. Samuel emerged from the barn carrying the morning's milk pail, his movements showing the contentment of a man whose life had found its proper rhythm. The weariness that had marked his demeanor during Catherine's early days at the ranch had been replaced by something approaching peace. "Any word from Denver?" he asked quietly, settling beside her on the porch steps where they often sat together in the evening hours. "Nothing for 6 months now," Catherine replied. I think Father has finally accepted that his threats can't reach us here. Harrison Morrison's attempts at retribution had proved futile against the legal protections of Catherine's marriage and Thomas's adoption. The territorial authorities had little patience for wealthy men who tried to use federal influence to settle family disputes, and Judge Pemberton's detailed report had closed most avenues for further harassment. Maria appeared in the doorway carrying a steaming plate of fresh biscuits, her face wreathed in the satisfied smile of a woman who had witnessed love triumph over adversity. "Senora Catherine," she said, setting the plate on the wooden table Samuel had built for their outdoor meals. "The letter from your friend in Boston, it comes today." Catherine accepted the envelope eagerly, recognizing the elegant handwriting of her former schoolmate who had become her connection to the wider world beyond the ranch. The letter contained news of mutual acquaintances, social developments in eastern cities, and the kind of intellectual discussion Catherine had missed during her exile from polite society. "Margaret Whitmore is getting married next spring," Catherine announced, scanning the letter. "To a professor of literature at Harvard. She wants to know if we might consider visiting Boston for the wedding." Samuel looked up from his coffee with interest. "Would you like to go?" The question would have been impossible to answer a year ago, when their marriage existed primarily on paper and their future remained uncertain. Now, the prospect of traveling together as a family, of introducing Samuel and Thomas to the broader world beyond Colorado territory, felt natural and exciting. "I think I would," Catherine replied. "Thomas has never seen the ocean, and you've never experienced a proper Boston spring." "Can we really go, Mama?" Thomas had approached quietly during their conversation, his eyes bright with the possibility of adventure. "If Samuel thinks the ranch can spare us for a few weeks, then yes, we can really go." Samuel studied the hopeful faces of his wife and son, these two people who had transformed his solitary existence into something rich with possibility. The ranch would survive their temporary absence, and the world beyond their valley held experiences that might broaden Thomas's understanding of his place in it. "I think," Samuel said slowly, "that it's time this family saw something of the world beyond our mountain valley." Thomas whooped with delight and ran to share the news with Miguel, while Catherine reached over to squeeze Samuel's weathered hand. "Thank you," she said simply. "For what?" "For giving us roots deep enough that we can risk growing wings." The morning sun climbed higher over the ranch that had become their sanctuary, their battleground, and finally their home. In the distance, Thomas's laughter echoed across the valley as he shared his excitement with anyone willing to listen, the sound carrying promises of adventures yet to come, and the confidence that comes from knowing exactly where home will be when the journeying ends.